Massive spoilers for Attack on Titan Season 4. You have been warned. If you're watching this from here, I'm assuming you've watched the entire show, so tread carefully. The war between Marley and Parody that began in Attack on Titan Season 4, before abruptly being cut short by the rumbling, appeared to be an unwinnable war of extermination for Parody. To the Jaegerists and those on the island of Parody, the rumbling appeared justified, because what were they supposed to do? It was either us or them, as the war itself was unwinnable without the rumbling. But is this true? I would argue that with a bit of strategic wisdom, patience, and copious amounts of determination, that the war with Marley was a completely winnable conflict for Parody, and if they play their cards right, the rumbling is completely unnecessary. Now, I'm not saying that it'd be possible for Parody to outright conquer Marley, but it is very possible for them to fight Marley to a stalemate and secure their independence while undermining the legitimacy of the Marleyan Empire in the eyes of its citizens. Firstly, in the show, how does the war play out? After successfully clearing the island of Parody of Titans in 850 and discovering Grisha Jaeger's basement, Parody is left in a very peculiar position. They've just made an incomprehensible leap in the knowledge of their world and their place in it, only comparable in our history to the opening of the Edo Japan in 1853, which had just undergone 265 years of international isolationism under the Tokugawa, or the arrival of the Spanish in the New World, where the Aztecs suddenly realized that not only were they not the only civilization in the world, but that they were small, behind the times, and outgunned. They were unknowingly the isolated heirs of a fallen empire from over a century ago, and were permanently demonized by the other nations of the world as devils deserving death and genocide, with a permanent gun over their head from an empire a century more advanced than them wanting to wipe them out. Their torture at the hands of the Titans over the past century wasn't divine punishment as they had believed, and they were not the last of mankind. They were unknowingly a subjugated people, both externally by the empire of Marley that bordered them, and internally by a royal family that was content to see its own people slowly wiped out as a form of atonement. Parody was in a very precarious position, caught between a rock and a hard place. Caught over a century technologically behind the times, Parody sent out ambassadors and spies in order to explore and understand the world, with Eren becoming an undercover Eldian soldier in the Marleyan army. This is actually very similar to what Edo Japan did in our world after the Meiji Restoration. Eldians were kept as second-class citizens in an empire that kept them in districts away from the more affluent Marleyans, indoctrinated them from birth of their original sin because of the actions of their ancestors. Marley was wrapping up a successful war with the Mideast Alliance at the time, and had its gaze elsewhere, which gave Parody a small amount of breathing room to catch up technologically. To aid in this, diplomats from Hizuru, an old ally of Eldia, began reaching out to form some kind of an alliance or trade agreement, both sharing the enemy of Marley. Hizuru also wanted the plentiful oil deposits that apparently lied under Parody, as well as the ice burst crystals that the Parody had been using to power their ODM gear. By the way, the world map of Attack on Titan is just an inverted world map of our world. It's pretty cool. The island of Parody, where the show takes place, is Madagascar, and the Marleyan Empire is Africa and some of Europe, and the Mideast Alliance is around Iran/India, and Hizuru is located somewhere around Indonesia or Australia. And so, knowing of the impending war of conquest that Marley intended to conduct against them, the scouts began to capture and take prisoner any Marleyan ships that came close to their shores, in order to both eliminate more Titans from being unleashed upon Parody, and to acquire information, tech, and allies from the outside world, in preparation for the incoming war. They learned of the anti-Marleyan volunteers led by Yelena, who informed them of the staggering military might of Marley. The Marleyan Empire possessed a fleet of 63 battleships and a 1 million-man total strong army. Parody, in comparison, had an estimated population of about 1 million in total, and no navy to speak of. Yeah, they were cooked by all accounts. Their enemy had a military equivalent to their population. Then, 4 years later, through the use of spies, Parody learns that the inevitable was coming. The long-feared yet anticipated declaration of war by Marley, with its million-strong army and dominant navy, was here. In Liberia, the Tiberns, the first Eldians to betray Eldia for Marley, and who possessed the Warhammer Titan, were to put on a skit and announce their casus belli for war to a collection of international diplomats and observers, as well as the combined brass of the entire Marleyan military. And this is where the first battle of the war takes place. Paradis, now Eldia, launches the Battle of Liberia once war is declared by Tybern. It's a devastating victory for Eldia by all accounts. The Warhammer and Beast Titans are seized. The entire brass of the Marleyan military is wiped out. A large percentage of Marley's state-of-the-art fleet that is hella expensive to build is wiped out in port. Marley loses thousands of experienced troops at the cost of only 9 members of the scout regiment. Eldia, as a result of this battle, now holds 5 out of the 9 Titans, being the Colossal, Founding, Attack, Warhammer, and Beast Titans, leaving Marley with just the Cart, Jaw, and Armored Titans left, with the female Titan now being an inept POW in the caverns of Paradis, as well as much of their prize fleet being wiped out. This is a veritable Battle of Pearl Harbor, with an overwhelming Eldian victory that further cements Eren Yeager as a national hero for Eldia. This battle appears a crushing victory, but in my opinion was actually a major strategic blunder that doomed Eldia to losing the war unless it unleashed the rumbling. Nonetheless, this battle does result in a power struggle within Eldia between the old brass and the youthful nationalistic Jaegerists. However, while the civil war is beginning to unfold, the Marleyans launch a surprise counterattack on Shiganshira. They had anticipated the attack at Liberia and had made preparations for the brass of their military to be wiped out. And so they launch a devastating aerial operation against Shiganshira in an attempt to either eliminate or acquire Eren Yeager before he could use Zeke to initiate the rumbling. This was a battle that Marley nearly won, initially mopping the floor with the Eldians, who weren't used to the accuracy from range modern rifles gave the Marleyans. The Eldians were used to being able to sit idly by while preparing for decisive close-quarters combat as Titans approached from a distance. The Marleyans didn't grant that opportunity and used their aerial advantage to fly straight over the walls and bombard the Eldians, as well as nearly catching Eren off guard in the initial attack. However, having the home ground, the Eldians rally, with a dense urban environment favoring their ODM gear and their close-quarters combat style. The Beast Titan eventually arrives and brings down the Zeppelins from the sky, and turns many Eldians into Titans, whom only the Eldian troops have both the weapons and combat experience necessary to combat, leading to a rout of the Marleyan forces. Then Zeke and Eren touch, quarrel in the halls of time for a decade or so, and unleash the rumbling, which is basically the end of the conventional war. The war is over at that point. Eren, at least what he announced to the public, does the rumbling because the military situation is ultimately fruitless. Eldia is facing an international coalition with multiple empires barreling down on them in less than 6 months, determined to genocide the island no matter the cost, with mercy off the table. The only way for them to survive is to preemptively genocide the entire world before they can do the same to Eldia. Now, I would argue that this is tremendous folly on the part of Eren and Eldia. The rumbling is not necessary whatsoever. Obvious is obvious, Eren Yeager becomes the largest mass murderer in world history by a massive proportion, completely unforgivable. He'll see Armin in the center of hell, easily. He genocides 80% of mankind. For a frame of reference, World War II, the deadliest war in our human history, killed an estimated 3 to 4% of the world population in our world. The most comparable event in our world is the Mongols, who in the 1200s butchered approximately 40 million people, about 10% of the global population at the time. They killed so many people that it made mountains appear snow-covered from a distance because of the numbers of bones on them. So many people that it reduced the carbon footprint of the Earth to such a degree that it can be observed in Antarctic ice cores. Eren Yeager butchers far more than that. And what makes it even worse is that it's not even necessary. Not even a limited rumbling against Marley was needed, I would argue. The war between Marley and Eldia was winnable from the start by Eldia through conventional means alone, making this wholesale slaughter completely unjustifiable. Now, Eldia appears to be in a really bad situation, with the military of Marley being both more advanced and larger, but it's not as bad as you might suspect. A large portion of the actual fighting forces of Marley are Eldians forced in as conscripts, while the brass is staffed by Marleyans. This means that the Eldians are the troops with the most combat experience, as seen in their war with the Mideast. Thus, a large proportion of Marley's fighting force could not really be deployed against Eldia, otherwise they'd risk mass defections and desertions to Paradis, with troops taking out their officers and running to the other side, unwilling to slaughter their own kin who are offering an easy way out. Examples from our history of this happening are how German conscripts from Alsace-Lorraine were sent to fight Russia rather than France in World War I so that they didn't defect or feel sympathies for the enemy. Or how Austria, not understanding this as well as Germany in World War I, sent Czechoslovaks to fight Russia, who had defected to Russia because they felt no desire to fight their fellow Slavs for an empire that only kept them down. So Marley couldn't use a large portion of its most experienced forces because they would just defect to Eldia. Marley was also a very large empire surrounded by enemies that had to be held down. Heck, they were just at war with the Mideast a couple years ago. Don't you think that the Mideast would love to take advantage of a distracted Marley to reclaim some of their lost territory and forts from a couple years ago? Marley cannot commit all of its forces to the genocide of Paradis, as it needs to guard its borders from its enemies and to hold down its massive empire. This is why, in my opinion, the raid on Liberia was such a strategic blunder by Eldia. Yeah, it was a military victory, but a political disaster. After such a callous attack that killed so many foreign delegations, along with slaughtering so many fellow Eldians in the district, nations of the world would be pissed at Eldia, having no sympathy for their plight. Eldia basically confirmed to the international community that they were the dangerous threat that the Marleyans said they were. Natural allies of Eldia like the Mideast and Hizaru would be hesitant to assist Eldia after such an attack, and would probably remain neutral or even vaguely support Marley. After all, they don't know who the people on Paradis are. They only know what Willie Tyburn has told them. And with Aaron destroying Liberia in a display with such presentation, the story that the old barbaric Eldian Empire has returned with vengeance seems like a very credible story. They basically proved the Marleyan propaganda right with this raid. So that's a big strategic blunder. Instead, what they could have done is they should have used Liberia in Willie Tyburn's speech as an opportunity to do the opposite of attacking. Have a small group of capable agents ready to die as POWs seize the stage, announce to the international community the Eldian commitment to peace. Somebody sympathetic with good public speaking abilities should take the stage as Eldia's official ambassador, maybe someone like Hanji or Pixis. So after seizing the stage, Pixis takes the stage and announces that he, as the ambassador of Eldia and servant of Her Majesty Historia Rice, after a century of isolation, are ready to open up to the world and engage in trade, and their unwavering commitment to peace is not to be questioned. They are a peaceful people and have no desire for war. Announce this to the international community. After this, after they're escorted off the stage and tortured and taken as POWs by Marley, the ambassadors would know what's going on. The great empire of Marley is just looking for another pawn to subjugate and conquer. Their mission would be a success. The ambassadors in the audience would respect Pixis as a fellow ambassador, and would recognize Paradis as a legitimate monarchy being trespassed by Marley. Willie Tyburn's speech would be completely undermined. The ambassadors would know that Eldia hasn't attacked anyone for the past century. They have no bad blood with Eldia. It's been the empire of Marley that's been kicking down their doors and shooting their wives, not Eldia. They'd be able to read between the lines and know that this is just another war of conquest for Marley. To the opinions of the international community, Marley would be the aggressor, not Eldia in this scenario. Eldia would be seen as a stable, peaceful kingdom acting in its own self-defense. In such a world, Eldia might be able to convince the Mideast to resume their war against Marley, now with an ally by their side. And if the Mideast or Hizru aren't willing to join Eldia in war, they'll certainly want to fund Eldia and provide them with equipment and advisors to pin Marley down. Similar to how in our world, NATO provides Ukraine equipment against Russia, which allows Ukraine to punch far above its weight, Eldia could do the same against Marley. Use the ships you have to send ambassadors to other nations. The other nations would still be hesitant, still wanting to use Paradis as the universal enemy, while simultaneously wanting to supply them to weaken Marley. The ambassadors would have to carefully lay out their situation and explain why Paradis had been isolated for a century. Keep in mind that it's unlikely that any other nation besides Marley would know of the Titans that infested Paradis. To the rest of the world, Paradis has just been absent from the international stage for a century, and they have no idea why. And even if this operation to convince the world of Eldia's commitment to peace fails, if you were a diplomat reporting back to your home nation, with reports talking about how the old power of Eldia is reborn, back with vengeance, capable and totally willing to unleash the rumbling on your nation if they consider you a threat, how do you think they would actually react? They'd think, crap, let's make sure to not get on those people's bad sides. They'd want to be friends with this new rising power and do everything they can to convince them that they're not a threat to the new Eldian Empire. Sure, in their hearts, they may loathe this new power with a passion, but when a gun is pointed over their heads, they'll choose the route of self-preservation above all else. And then, once the rumbling doesn't happen, which is Marley's whole justification and casus belli to begin the war, Marley will look like it just lied to the entire world in a vain attempt to join them on a war of extermination. Even without international allies, the Eldians could give Marley a run for their money. Eldia has many other strategic advantages that Marley doesn't. The number one being that Eldia is an island, namely Madagascar, making it very hard to conquer, much like how Britain has been throughout its history. The English Channel has protected Britain from countless foreign invaders over the centuries, and has been its primary defensive line. Similarly, the Mozambique Channel protects Eldia from Marley in a similar fashion. The shortest distance across the English Channel is 34 kilometers. The shortest distance across the Mozambique Channel is 419 kilometers. Mounting this war would not be an easy operation for Marley. And that's the number one advantage. All Eldia has to do is win the naval battle. Act like Britain. Go completely in on the Navy. Navy, Navy, Navy. Marley has to use their 63 battleships to guard the entire coastline of Africa and the Mediterranean Sea. Eldia just has to focus on control of the Mozambique Channel. This naval warfare also plays into Eldia's other massive advantage, being Armin, the colossal titan. Just like in the anime's raid on Liberia, Armin has the ability to essentially go from port to port and just nuke every ship that's sitting in port. There's really no counter to this tactic. The colossal titan can swim, being the only titan viable in water, as seen in the rumbling. Colossal titans can swim extremely far, very rapidly. You could just have Armin as the colossal titan himself, go to a nearby Marleyan port on a ship, or just swim there himself, destroy all the ships in port, and swim back. This might only work a couple times before the Marleyans start surrounding each port with artillery in preparation for this kind of attack, which would make it too dangerous for Armin to attempt because they can't afford to lose the colossal titan. But this would be plenty enough to severely damage the Marleyan fleet. This doesn't even account for the kind of threat Armin would face for any Marleyan troops attempting to land in some D-Day style fashion. Any landing force that Marley would array against Eldia would just be wiped out on the beaches by the colossal titan and whatever defenses the Eldia would place 400 kilometers from the Marleyan homeland. So build defenses along the coast, invest in a navy, and launch raids on Marleyan ports, and Marley will be struggling to mount an effective invasion, no matter their fleet's size. The other main threat to Eldia is the air superiority that Marley has. As shown in the anime, Marley's Zeppelin fleet allows them to conduct airborne operations deep into Eldia. This is a serious threat, but one that Eldia can definitely counter. Eldia has a monopoly on Ice Burst Stone, which is what powers their ODM gear. In the anime, Hizuru already wants this Ice Burst Stone, and has designed a plane that uses it as fuel. Whatever the Ice Burst Stone is, it has tremendous potential in aerial warfare to wipe the Marleyan Zeppelins out of the sky with Eldian planes that could fly circles around the slow-moving Zeppelins. With enough determination and collaboration with allies like Hizuru, Eldia could become dominant in the skies, especially since they have a monopoly on Ice Burst Stone. And what else is right below the island of Parity in copious amounts, which is another big reason Marley desperately wants their hands on Parity? Oh yeah, oil! The thing that goes in planes which Marley doesn't have enough of. With their petroleum deposits, if they can learn how to harvest it, Eldia would soon be capable of fielding an air force and navy nearly the size of Marley's. And, before their air forces are ready, whether by replicating the designs of Marley's Zeppelins or innovating their own planes, Eldia could soon get its hands on all the air defense it needs, being the Beast Titan, who is already looking to defect to Eldia. Even without the raid on Liberia, Zeke is still disloyal to Marley and would be looking for a way across the sea. If Eldia can secure him, then for the time being he's all the air defense Eldia would need. As seen in the anime, he can just snipe Zeppelins out of the sky in a moment's notice. The strategic depth of Eldia is even further enhanced by the 3 walls old King Fritz erected 100 years ago. It's a great defense against Titans 100%, but it's also the ultimate defense against an invading army. Your number one goal when defending Paradis is building a good navy and defending your coastlines to the teeth with fortifications and machine guns. But even if these are breached, Eldia can totally retreat behind its 3 defensive walls, just as it's already been doing for the past century. These walls corral invaders to the entrances, which are easily defensible with machine guns and copious amounts of artillery fire. Remember, Marley doesn't have access to ODM gear to scale the walls, because it doesn't have access to Ice Burst Stone, which is exclusively located on Eldia, meaning their only way to breach the walls would be through aerial operations, like the Zeppelin raid on Shiganshina in the anime. This unsupported paratrooper operation was effective in the anime because it was a surprise attack, and Eldia had never before engaged in this style of warfare. But even in the anime, the Marleyans still lost the battle as they got bogged down in the urban environment. Unsupported paratrooper operations without total control of the skies, or especially ground forces coming in from the rear to back it up, are notoriously unreliable, as seen in World War II with the Operation Market Garden as an easy example. To put it simply, Marley is going to have to break through the walls normally, through the entrances. Their artillery doesn't have the power to bust through the walls conventionally, and doing so would only awaken the colossal titans within, which would spell the end for Marley, so they have no option but to go through the entrances if they want to breach the walls. Because of the colossals in the walls, the only way Marley could breach the walls would be over or under them, or through their narrow entrance. Another tactic of Marley, dropping titans on cities, like what they did against the Mideast in Season 4, Episode 1, would be the least effective against Eldia of all of the different nations, considering their specialty over the past century has been fighting titans. And even if Marley did break through Walmaria, they'd still have 2 more walls left to penetrate, and breaking through each wall requires a very effective combined arms operation by Marley in the first place, which they might not be able to pull off. Logistics would be the other killer for Marley. Having to transport entire armies across the Mozambique Channel would be a nightmare enough on their supply lines. However, even if they successfully landed and took the beaches, the lack of openings through the walls, except via narrow entrances, would be a logistical nightmare for Marley. Imagine you've already taken Walmaria and are attempting to break through Walsena. You need to transport everything you need through 4 very narrow entrances that are very vulnerable to sabotage by the Eldians. These narrow entrances would need to support and disperse the necessary siege equipment to tens of thousands of soldiers to even have a chance of taking the next wall. Whether against Titans or a conventional invading army, the walls remain the greatest assets of the Eldians. You couldn't even siege the walls, the normal counter to defensive walls in history. If you were sieging Constantinople, with its legendary defensive walls, you could rely on the fact that the city would starve without aid, and could only hold out for maybe a couple years, as they would just run out of food. Eldia didn't have this weakness, and could legitimately live with invaders outside of the walls perpetually. Marley would be forced to take the walls by force. And then there's the final and maybe the most important factor that ensures Eldia's survival, and that's that Eldia is fighting for its life. It knows its enemy. It knows Marley is coming to wipe them out. All of them. It knows that its enemy has been attempting to exterminate them for over a century through their titans, which alone would create tremendous hatreds and a desire for revenge. As Sun Tzu said, it's unwise to put your enemy on death ground, because if they know that they will die if they don't fight, then they will fight fanatically to the bitter end. If you threaten every Eldian with extermination, then they will fight to the death, because death is the only option that they're being given. And if I'm going to die, I might as well die fighting for my freedom. What level of dedication could be expected of Marley in comparison? Without the attack on Liberia, Marley would have the Warhammer Titan, sure, and a more experienced officer corps. Nice. That's an advantage they didn't have in the anime. But could they really expect their soldiers to fight well, especially now that they're not the only ones with titans to throw around in the war? Eldia would still have the Beast, Colossal, Attack, and Founding Titans, which would put tremendous stresses on the Marleyan military, as they're not used to fighting titans, only using them. They have no experience fighting titans themselves, while their enemies have an abundant amount. This alone might buy Eldia some time in the early stages of the war. Marley, as an empire, could not defeat Eldia if Eldia stood and fought, with or without the rumbling. Even a partial rumbling isn't necessary. Eldia's strategic situation isn't hopeless, and is even winnable if they play their cards right. There are many examples in history of islands holding out against far larger continental empires, whether Britain against France or Germany, Taiwan against China, Japan against the Mongols, or even to a lesser extent the Greeks against the Persians. So no, genocide wasn't necessary. The rumbling wasn't necessary. There was no justifiable reason to wipe out 80% of mankind, no matter the silver lining. An eye for an eye and the world goes blind, as Gandhi would say. Don't win a war via genocide, win it by winning the war. Also, by the way, the rumbling would cause a mass extinction event of all life on Earth, not just humanity. Think of what would happen if all the trees on Earth were destroyed, as well as all the rainforests. Earth would descend rapidly into either mass global warming or mass global cooling across all climate types. Biodiversity on Earth would be pushed through a bottleneck. The climate would change so much that you would see mass famine on Paradis as the globe either rapidly cooled or warmed, causing widespread crop failures on Paradis, causing famine and mass civil wars and unrest that would be far deadlier than if Paradis just fought Marley conventionally. The rumbling wasn't the correct decision geopolitically for Paradis, because, despite the world's animosity and putrid disgust of Eldians, I seriously doubt they'd be willing to fight alongside Marley, a giant empire who picks fights with all of its neighbors to do so. Madagascar is completely isolated from the entire world except Africa. Any power that wants to genocide Eldia will have to do so on Marley's terms, which I seriously doubt any of them would be willing to do, making this war a 1v1 between Eldia and Marley, which is deceptively winnable for Eldia. We forget how easily even the bitterest of enemies come to terms when they have shared enemies. For an easy example, think of how the Soviets aligned with the Germans with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of World War II, despite the two, on paper, having ideologies literally crafted towards the extermination of the other. Or how, when Operation Barbarossa began, the Soviet Union and America immediately allied each other, despite once again on paper being complete ideological enemies. No other nation in the world is going to be bearing down on Paradis except Marley, and Marley isn't as formidable of a foe as it may appear on its surface. Because, at its core, Marley is a paper tiger of an empire that can't afford a bloody stalemate of a war. It's picking fights with all of its neighbors, and is having to hold down subject peoples all over the globe, not just Eldians. Onyankopon's people are an easy example of this. Marley's problem with its subject peoples is just how much it twists the knife into them, like the Eldians. For an example from our history, the Ottoman Empire lasted 500 years, with many subject peoples that it kept as second-class citizens, with restrictions on their rights and a condescending tolerance. They managed this because they didn't twist the knife into their subject peoples. As long as the Greeks paid their taxes and served as janissaries, the Ottomans let them be Orthodox Christians and keep their identity until the 19th century. For an easy opposite example, apartheid South Africa had many subject peoples it treated like second-class citizens. But a big reason apartheid South Africa lasted 50 years, while the Ottomans lasted 500 years, is that South Africa couldn't help itself but to twist the knife deep into their subject peoples, cultivating a society that actively belittled them and taught them how shitty they were at every single turn. Marley, by treating its subject peoples so terribly, will pay its dues. It's an empire experiencing decadence, similar to the late Roman Empire, in which its original population of Marleyans that forged the empire are becoming wealthy and corrupt, with the military being staffed by its subject peoples. And just like when the Roman Empire began to rely on Germans to staff the military, who had no loyalty to Rome, the empire crumbled. And when Marley does come crumbling down decades or centuries later, Eldia, with its experienced military and the best navy in the world, will be in prime position to become the single power on the continent, with the many Eldian enclaves within Marley who remained on the continent in their ghettos becoming the perfect proxies to expand Eldia's influence and join the new Eldian Empire. That seems pretty good by all accounts for Eldia, becoming the Britain of Africa. In comparison, what does the Rumbling accomplish? The Rumbling creates a wasteland of a continent that needs to be completely resettled from the bottom up, a continent that is now completely devoid of trees, or any large animals to hunt or plow the land. Just open ground. Perfect conditions for the Sahara Desert to expand down to the tip of Africa, without any trees or rainforests or large plants left to keep it in check. When the biosphere is destroyed this thoroughly, you can expect that when famine grips Eldia, and Eldians start turning on each other for the little arable land and food that is left, they might start wishing they could go back to the good old days, when their guns were aimed at foreign adversaries rather than their own people. So to the Jaegerists who say that the Rumbling was the only and best way to save Eldia,
you lack imagination.